The air inside the hearing room felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. Cameras clicked, pens hovered, and every eye locked on the sharp exchange about to unfold. On one side sat Judge Thapar, his robe and reputation carrying the weight of establishment power. On the other sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, her gaze steady, her voice calm, her very presence a challenge to the old order. Thapar leaned in, words sharpened like a blade, his tone dripping with condescension. "Representative, perhaps you don't quite understand the legal framework here," he said, the words calculated to corner her, to belittle her expertise, to reduce her to a soundbite. It wasn't just a question, it was a trap, a deliberate attempt to paint her as unprepared, out of her depth, a figure outmatched by his authority. For a moment, the room froze. Supporters of Thapar smirked. Critics of Crockett braced themselves for the stumble they were certain was coming. The cameras caught every flicker, every twitch of expression. And then, time seemed to slow. The narration of history itself interrupted the scene. What happened in the next 60 seconds left the room stunned, and the country buzzing. Crockett did not flinch. She did not fumble through notes or stammer a response. Instead, she lifted her chin, her eyes narrowing with the focus of someone who had been underestimated her entire life. This wasn't just another line of questioning. This was the establishment's hand pressing down on her, daring her to break, and that's why the silence felt so heavy. The judge expected obedience. The crowd expected capitulation. But Crockett was about to deliver something no one in that chamber, perhaps not even her allies, saw coming. Her pause stretched just long enough to build anticipation, a silence that became louder than any words. Tension rippled across the room like a live wire. Reporters' pens stopped moving. Even Thapar's smirk wavered, just slightly, as if he knew, in some unspoken way, that he had just triggered something beyond his control. Because in this chamber, in this very moment, the balance of power was about to shift. And when Crockett finally spoke, her words would not just answer the judge, they would reverberate far beyond these walls. But to understand just how much was at stake, we have to step back. Because what happened when the judge pressed harder changed everything. This wasn't just another hearing, another clash of personalities in Washington's endless theater. The stakes here cut deeper, threading into questions of justice, representation, and the kind of country America wants to be. On the surface, it looked like a courtroom sparring match. In reality, it was a battle of identities, elitism, cloaked in authority against the resilience of someone who carried the struggles of her community into the heart of power. Judge Thapar sat with the weight of the establishment at his back. As one of the highest-ranking judges in the country, he represented the system itself. Polished, powerful, and rarely challenged. His words carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, to having the final say. That aura alone was enough to intimidate most people. He had the bench, the robe, and decades of judicial precedent as his armor. Too many watching, it seemed impossible that anyone, let alone a first-term congresswoman, could match him. But Jasmine Crockett was not just anyone. She wasn't stepping into that room as a lone voice. She stood as a vessel for generations, who had been told to stay silent, to defer, to let authority define their worth. Every gaze on her that day, every microphone pointed in her direction, was a reminder that this moment carried more than her own reputation. She was defending dignity itself, her own, and that of countless others who shared her struggles. The hearing had been billed as routine, but it quickly became a spectacle. The contrast was cinematic. Thapar, the polished jurist with an Ivy League sheen, versus Crockett, the unyielding daughter of Texas, who had carved her path through grit and unapologetic honesty. To some, she was brash. To others, she was fearless. And in this chamber, her every word would either validate the doubts of her critics or ignite the hopes of her supporters. What made it all the more urgent was the symbolism hanging over the confrontation. For decades, figures like Thapar had dominated the narrative, their voices amplified, their judgments seen as final. But here was a woman, black, outspoken, and proudly unfiltered, refusing to shrink beneath his authority. If she stumbled, it would feed every stereotype about inexperience and lack of preparation. If she stood tall, it would signal a seismic shift, that the tables were turning, that power could be answered with truth. The nation sensed it. Social media feeds buzzed even before the climax. Commentators whispered about the clash as if it were a heavyweight fight. Supporters of Crockett leaned forward, anxious, desperate for her to strike back. Detractors sharpened their attacks, certain that Thapar's experience would box her in. The atmosphere outside the chamber mirrored the intensity inside, and that's what made her composure so electrifying. Crockett didn't blink, and she didn't. She absorbed the judge's attempt to corner her, as if she had been preparing for this exact moment her entire life. With each second of silence, she held the room hostage not through authority, but through presence. The trap had been set. The expectation was humiliation, but the outcome, that remained uncertain. Every viewer watching, every reporter scribbling notes, felt the tension twisting tighter. Because what happened when Judge Thapar pressed harder didn't just shift the balance in that room. It shifted the story America was about to tell itself. And to understand why his downfall was inevitable, we have to look at who he really is. To understand why this clash carried such weight, you need to know who Judge Amul Thapar is, not the polished biography that gets read aloud at ceremonies, but the full picture, the contradictions beneath the robe, because this wasn't just a man asking pointed questions. This was an embodiment of a system that has too often confused authority with justice. Born to immigrant parents and rising through the ranks of law, Thapar carved a reputation as a conservative star. He became the first federal judge of South Asian descent, a milestone that carried undeniable symbolism. For years, his story was framed as one of representation, of breaking barriers. On paper, he was the dream, a son of immigrants who had reached the heights of America's judiciary. That's the image, the carefully polished veneer. But beneath that story, a different narrative unfolded. Thapar aligned himself closely with the conservative legal movement, the same machinery that worked tirelessly to roll back voting rights, to narrow protections for marginalized communities, to reinterpret the Constitution through a lens of restriction, rather than expansion. He became a favorite of powerful circles, a reliable voice for elite interests cloaked in the legitimacy of jurisprudence. His name floated repeatedly on shortlists for the Supreme Court. Conservative donors and think tanks championed him as a model judge, disciplined, ideological, and loyal to the cause. To his admirers, he represented the future of the right, diverse in face, but unwavering in service to an agenda that often undercut the very communities he symbolized. That paradox fueled both his rise and his criticism, because if his identity suggested progress, his rulings often did the opposite. Again and again, cases before him revealed a tendency to side with corporate power over workers, to uphold law and order crackdowns over compassion, to use the language of neutrality while delivering outcomes that tilted toward the powerful. His defenders argued that he was simply applying the law as written. His critics pointed to a paterna coldness toward the vulnerable, a willingness to let precedent justify inequality. This is where the arrogance creeps in. In public appearances, Thapar often exudes calm authority, but beneath it lies an unmistakable smugness, the confidence of someone who knows he has the system at his back. That's what viewers saw in the hearing room, not just a judge asking questions, but a man radiating the assumption that his robe, his resume, his network of influence, would shield him from real challenge. And here lies the irony. For all his stature, for all the reverence he commanded in conservative legal circles, Thapar had rarely faced an opponent who refused to play by his script. In courtrooms, lawyers defer. In hearings, witnesses stumble. But Jasmine Crockett, she wasn't interested in deference. She wasn't afraid of the robe, the rank, or the carefully curated biography. She was ready to confront the man beneath the mask. That's why his attempt to corner her mattered. It wasn't just a tactical question. It was a performance of power and effort to remind everyone in the room of who he was, of the hierarchy he believed was unshakable. But power built on intimidation always carries a fatal flaw. The moment someone refuses to be intimidated, the entire facade begins to crack. And Thapar's contradictions made that crack inevitable. He styled himself as a symbol of immigrant success, yet consistently aligned with forces hostile to the very spirit of inclusion. He claimed neutrality, yet leaned into ideology. He wielded authority, yet confused it for wisdom. These tensions had always been there, simmering beneath the surface. It only took one unflinching challenger to expose them for the world to see. That's why this wasn't just Crockett versus Thapar. It was Crockett versus everything he represented. The arrogance of entrenched power, the contradiction of claiming diversity while enabling exclusion, the brittle nature of authority when confronted with truth. His downfall didn't come from a single line of questioning. It came from the reality that his power was never as solid as he wanted the world to believe. And when you see who stood across from him, you'll understand why this clash became inevitable. Because Jasmine Crockett's story was nothing like his. Hers was a story of grit, sacrifice, and a defiance forged in struggle. And that's what made her the one person who could not just withstand his trap, but turn it into his undoing. She wasn't supposed to be the one who could flip the script. And yet, if Judge Thapar embodied the weight of the establishment, Jasmine Crockett embodied the fight to break through it. To understand the gravity of this confrontation, you need to know her journey, the path that sharpened her voice, the hardships that steeled her resolve, and the conviction that made her refusal to bow down feel inevitable. Crockett's story is not one of inherited power or elite grooming. She wasn't born into circles of privilege, nor did she glide into politics on the coattails of legacy. She grew up in Texas, surrounded by the grit of communities that worked harder than they were ever rewarded, communities whose struggles were rarely given the dignity of attention. From the very beginning, she saw what it meant to fight uphill battles in a system designed to look past people like her. Law became her weapon not because she idolized the courtroom, but because she saw it as one of the few arenas where the powerless could demand accountability. She started as a public defender, standing beside clients the system had already written off. People without money, without connections, often without hope. Day after day, she looked into the eyes of those society dismissed and she refused to let them be invisible. That's where her fire was forged, in dingy courtrooms, against prosecutors who assumed easy wins, against judges who barely disguised their indifference. The experience marked her. She learned quickly that truth alone wasn't enough. You had to wield it like a blade, sharp and undeniable. She learned that the system respected composure more than anger, evidence more than emotion, but that the real skill was blending all three until even the most jaded listener couldn't look away. And she learned that people underestimated her at their own peril. So when she stepped into politics, she carried that same defiance with her. She wasn't polished in the way Washington prefers. She wasn't rehearsed, sanitized, or softened. She was raw, unapologetic, willing to speak uncomfortable truths, even when they rattled the room. That's why her supporters loved her. That's why her critics despised her. She refused to contort herself into what power expected. But behind the boldness was sacrifice. Running for office meant subjecting herself to scrutiny that went far beyond policy. Her identity, her blackness, her womanhood, her refusal to tone it down, was constantly weaponized against her. Headlines framed her as angry. Pundits called her unprofessional. Rivals dismissed her as unprepared. Every insult was designed to chip away at her legitimacy, to remind her of where they thought she belonged. And yet, she persisted. Each insult became fuel. Each dismissal became proof that she was exactly where she needed to be. She didn't just survive the gauntlet. She thrived in it, turning criticism into validation that she was shaking the right foundations. That's what made her so dangerous to someone like Judge Thapar. He had built his career on deference, on the assumption that authority would silence dissent. She had built hers on refusing to be silenced. Their trajectories could not have been more different. His smooth climb through elite structures, hers, a bruising fight against them. But here's the twist: Crockett never carried herself as a victim. She carried herself as a challenger. She believed deeply that her struggles weren't setbacks, but preparation. Every time she was underestimated, she learned how to strike more effectively. Every time she was cornered, she discovered how to turn the walls into leverage. And every time someone told her she didn't belong, she carved her name deeper into the story. That's why, when Thapar tried to corner her in that hearing, it wasn't just a question. It was the echo of every dismissal she had ever faced. It was the system once again saying, "You don't know enough. You aren't enough. You can't win." And that's why her response carried so much weight. Because when she spoke back, she wasn't just answering him, she was answering decades of exclusion. Not only for herself, but for every person who had been made to feel lesser. And this is where admiration turns into inspiration. For her supporters, watching Crockett wasn't passive entertainment, it was validation. It was proof that their voices, too, could stand against power. That the rules weren't unbreakable. That dignity could answer arrogance and win. She wasn't supposed to be the one to flip the script. She wasn't supposed to be the one who could stare down a federal judge and not blink. But that's the beauty of underdogs. They turn supposed to into dust. And in that chamber, as Crockett locked eyes with Thapar, every moment of her, past every courtroom, every insult, every uphill battle gathered into a single, steady force. She was ready. The question was, how far would the judge go to try to break her composure? Because the next phase of their exchange would push both of them past the point of no return. The silence broke with the sharp edge of Judge Thapar's voice, pressing harder, sharper, more insistent. He leaned on the authority of his position, words clipped and precise, as though each syllable carried the weight of law itself. His questions weren't really questions, they were snares, carefully constructed to force Crockett into a corner. "Representative," he said, the title rolling off his tongue with a trace of disdain. "Are you suggesting you know better than the courts on this matter?" The implication was clear. Stay in your lane. Defer to authority. Accept the hierarchy. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes remained steady, her posture unyielding. She let the judge's words hang in the air, allowed the room to taste the arrogance. Behind them, this wasn't just about the issue at hand. It was about whether a woman like her was allowed to speak with the same force as a man cloaked in judicial robes. The back and forth tightened like a coiled spring. Thapar fired another round, layering his words with technical jargon meant to obscure rather than clarify. "Do you have the legal foundation?" he asked. "To contradict precedent on this?" His tone suggested the answer had already been decided, that she would falter before the weight of his experience. The crowd leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in, every eyebrow raised, every head turned, waiting for Crockett to stumble. That's what they expected, what they always expected, that she would overreach, lose her composure. Give the judge exactly what he wanted, proof that she wasn't ready for this stage. But Crockett knew the game. She had seen it before, countless times, in smaller rooms with fewer cameras, prosecutors who tried to rattle her, judges who thought they could bury her with jargon, politicians who assumed they could talk over her. Every time, the same assumption that she didn't belong, that she would break, and every time, she proved them wrong. Her silence now wasn't hesitation, it was precision. She was listening, weighing, letting him build his case against himself. Each smug remark, each attempt to corner her, was a rope he was tightening around his own credibility. The tension escalated. A reporter scribbled furiously. A spectator coughed nervously. The atmosphere was suffocating, as though the very oxygen in the room had been drawn into this duel. And still, Crockett sat poised, her hands folded, her eyes never leaving Thapar's. He tried again, his voice cutting sharper. Are you truly qualified to make this claim, Representative? The room stirred at the audacity, at the blunt attempt to undermine not just her argument but her very legitimacy. That was the moment, the line where arrogance crossed into desperation, and that was when the energy shifted. The room, once aligned with the judge's authority, began to sense the imbalance. His insistence revealed insecurity. His confidence cracked just enough to expose fear of being bested by someone he had dismissed. Crockett inhaled slowly, her silence now heavy with anticipation. The pause stretched. Reporters stopped writing. Viewers watching at home leaned closer to their screens. The trap he had set hung wide open, daring her to step into it. And then, with the nation watching, with the tension stretched to its breaking point, she leaned forward. The moment had come. And then, with the nation watching, she struck. The room held its breath, every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she finally leaned forward, her posture composed, her voice steady. She didn't rush, she didn't lash out. Instead, she began with a simple truth, spoken with the calm authority of someone who knew exactly what she was about to unleash. Judge, she said, the word precise, cutting, almost surgical. I don't need to be cloaked in robes to know when power is being abused. The words landed like a first strike, controlled, measured, but heavy with intent. For a split second, silence hung, thicker than before. Thapar blinked, taken aback by the calmness in her tone. He had expected indignation, maybe defensiveness. What he got instead was clarity sharpened to a blade. Crockett continued, her voice growing stronger, the cadence deliberate. You keep asking if I am qualified to speak here. Let me tell you what qualifies me. I have stood beside people who never got a fair shake in your so-called system. I have watched judges dismiss their humanity with the wave of a hand. I have fought for those who didn't have the privilege of an Ivy League resume to protect them. That's my qualification. Living where the law meets real life, not where it hides behind prestige. A murmur rippled across the room. Reporters glanced up, pens frozen in mid-sentence. Even some of Thapar's allies shifted in their seats. The trap he had set suddenly looked flimsy, exposed for what it was, a performance of arrogance, not a triumph of logic. Thapar straightened in his chair, attempting to recover. Representative, he said, forcing a thin smile, this isn't about stories. This is about precedent, about the law. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned in closer, her eyes locking on his. Precedent, she echoed, the word dripping with challenge. You want to talk about precedent? The precedent I've seen is a system that bends over backward to protect the powerful while telling the rest of us to wait our turn. The precedent I've seen is people like you draped in titles telling people like me that we're out of line for speaking the truth. Well, that precedent ends here. Gasps spread through the chamber. It was no longer just a rebuttal. It was a takedown, a reframing of the entire dynamic. Crockett wasn't playing defense. She was rewriting the rules in real time. She paused, just long enough to let the weight of her words settle, then delivered the blow that would reverberate far beyond those walls. You ask if I'm qualified. I'm qualified because I refuse to bow down to intimidation. I'm qualified because I've lived the injustice you write about in abstract, and I'm qualified because, unlike you, I don't confuse authority with truth. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when a truth too raw to ignore has been spoken. Thapar shifted, visibly uncomfortable, his earlier smugness evaporating. For the first time, the mask of judicial authority looked thin, almost brittle. And then the reaction broke. A low hum of approval rolled through the spectators' building, like a wave. On social media, clips of her words were already being clipped, captioned, and shared. Tweets blazed with fire emojis and hashtags. Hashtag Crockett, shut it down, and hashtag truth over titles. Even before the hearing ended, the digital world was erupting. Crockett wasn't done. She let the reaction crest, then anchored her closing point with calm precision. You thought you could corner me, she said, her voice even, unwavering. But I don't live in corners. I live in the light, and the light exposes everything, especially arrogance dressed up as wisdom. It was the mic drop moment. Camera zoomed in on Thapar's face, the tension in his jaw, the nervous shuffle of papers in front of him. His authority had not only been challenged, it had been stripped bare. And the brilliance of Crockett's counterattack wasn't just in what she said, it was in how she said it. Every pause was calculated, every phrase sharpened. She didn't shout, she didn't rush. She commanded, she spoke as though the room belonged to her, as though every eye and every ear were there for her truth alone, and in that moment, they were. Observers would later describe it as a reversal of gravity. The judge, once the center of power, now looked small, diminished, a figure clinging to titles that suddenly seemed hollow. Crockett, the supposed underdog, stood taller than ever, her words echoing with the force of lived experience. And here's the part that made it unforgettable. She didn't gloat. She didn't bask in the moment. She let the silence that followed become her victory lap. The room knew she had one. The country knew she had one, and Thapar, despite his attempts to hide it, knew it too. The confrontation had started as a trap, but Crockett had turned it into a stage. And on that stage, she delivered not just a rebuttal, but a revelation. She had shown, in real time, what it looks like when dignity stands its ground against arrogance and wins. But the story didn't end in that room. What happened next took the spark of that exchange and turned it into a wildfire, because when Crockett walked out of that chamber, she didn't just leave behind a silenced judge, she left behind shockwaves that would ripple across the country. And those shockwaves were only just beginning. The chamber emptied, but the confrontation refused to stay contained. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped into the hallway, the moment had already escaped into the bloodstream of the internet. Clips of her takedown spread with the velocity of lightning. Within minutes, hashtags lit up Twitter, hashtag Crockett shut it down, hashtag truth over titles, and hashtag cornered no more. It wasn't just political junkies watching on C-SPAN anymore. Teenagers on TikTok were remixing her words with music drops, cutting the clip just before her final line, and letting beats crash on I don't confuse authority with truth. Instagram Reels paired her calm-piercing stare with filters and captions in bold fire-red text. The drama of the moment became a meme, and the meme became a movement. Cable news networks scrambled to catch up. On MSNBC, anchors replayed the exchange with visible delight, emphasizing the composure of Crockett against the unraveling of Thapar. On CNN, commentators described it as a seismic generational clash between old-guard elitism and a new wave of unapologetic truth. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it, though their framing was bitter, painting Crockett as grandstanding, a word that only amplified her supporters' rallying cry. Late-night comedians pounced. Monologues opened with jokes about Thapar, trying to flex and getting folded instead. One viral sketch even dramatized the moment, exaggerating his questions into cartoonish arrogance, followed by Crockett's.com one-liners knocking him back like dominoes. Laughter reinforced the truth. The judge hadn't just lost an exchange, he had lost face. But the ripple went deeper than entertainment. Activists seized the moment as a rallying cry. Community organizers in Texas blasted out clips in WhatsApp groups, calling Crockett's words a reflection of their own struggles against institutional condescension. College students shared it with captions like, "This is what standing your ground looks like." Pastors referenced it in sermons about dignity and courage. Even high school debate teams used it as inspiration, an example of how to disarm arrogance with calm precision. And Thapar, his polished facade, took a hit that no carefully worded press release could repair. He had walked into the chamber as an untouchable authority figure. He walked out as a meme. His attempt to diminish Crockett had backfired so completely that he became the punchline, not the victor. What made the shockwaves so powerful was that they weren't just about Crockett or Thapar. They were about what the clash symbolized. For millions watching, it was validation. It was proof that you didn't need establishment polish to stand against power, that the sharpest minds aren't always the ones sitting on the bench. That truth, when wielded with courage, could silence arrogance no matter how high it sits. Social validation poured in. Celebrities retweeted her clip with words like iconic and this is leadership. Journalists who had dismissed her before now admitted she had stolen the moment. Grassroots organizations raised funds. Off the wave, their donation pages buzzing with messages like, "I'm giving because she stood up when it mattered." The hearing, once expected to vanish into obscurity, became a cultural flashpoint. It wasn't just a headline, it was a turning point in narrative. Crockett emerged from the exchange not just as a congresswoman, but as a symbol, the one who looked power in the eye and refused to bow. And the resonance didn't stop with her supporters. Even skeptics admitted the optics had shifted. Conservative strategists worried privately about the fallout, noting that arrogance had been exposed. At the worst possible time, their champion had miscalculated, and the backlash was feeding energy into the very movement they had sought to contain. By the end of the week, one fact was undeniable. Jasmine Crockett's voice had outgrown the chamber. What had been meant as a moment of humiliation had become a national rallying cry. It wasn't just a moment anymore, it was a movement. But movements demand more than viral clips. They demand meaning, and the meaning of this clashed a lesson it carried for the country was about to come into focus. The viral moment could have ended as just another flash in the endless scroll of outrage and entertainment. But Jasmine Crockett refused to let it stop there. When she finally addressed the aftermath, her words shifted the story from a viral clip to a universal lesson. She didn't gloat. She didn't revel in Judge Thapar's humiliation. Instead, she reframed the exchange as something larger than herself. "This was never about me winning a point," she said in an interview that quickly spread online. "It was about showing that no one, no matter how high they sit, has the right to silence dignity, and that was the heart of it." Crockett turned the takedown into a parable. For her supporters, it became proof that arrogance can be shattered by composure, that justice isn't found in titles or robes but in truth spoken without fear. For the broader public, it became a reminder that democracy doesn't belong to the powerful few, it belongs to those willing to speak up, even when the odds are stacked. She invoked history, drawing connections between her exchange and the long lineage of Americans who had stood against impossible odds. Civil rights leaders who marched despite brutality, immigrants who built lives despite exclusion, women who spoke despite ridicule. Every time we refuse to be cornered, she said, we expand what freedom means. That message hit home because it transcended politics. It wasn't just about left versus right, judge versus congresswoman. It was about the timeless tension between those who hoard authority and those who demand accountability. Crockett's calm defiance became a vessel for a larger truth, that intimidation only works if we agree to be intimidated, and in a moment when many felt exhausted by cynicism, her words offered a spark of hope. She reminded people that dignity doesn't require permission, that courage doesn't need a title, that truth can cut through arrogance like light through shadow. It was this universal framing that transformed the exchange into something unforgettable. She wasn't just a politician defending her ground. She was a symbol of resistance, of possibility. Her critics could dismiss her tone, her passion, her style, but they couldn't dismiss the undeniable fact that, in that chamber, dignity had stood taller than power. And that's why the story resonated so deeply, because in watching her stand her ground, millions saw themselves, their frustrations, their silenced moments, their quiet dreams of justice reflected back at them. Crockett didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for them. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Truth outweighs intimidation. Service outshines hierarchy. Dignity eclipses arrogance. But Crockett wasn't finished. She knew moments like these weren't ends, they were beginnings. They were sparks meant to light larger fires. So she left her supporters with a challenge, not just a victory lap. If you believe in justice, if you believe in dignity, then this fight isn't mine alone, she said. It's ours. It was the perfect crescendo. A personal victory transformed into a collective call. A viral clip turned into a moral compass. And with that, the story was no longer just about Judge Thapar's failed attempt to corner Jasmine Crockett. It was about all of us. About what happens when ordinary people refuse to shrink. When voices once silenced rise. When courage becomes contagious. The moral was clear. But Crockett and her supporters knew the story wasn't over yet. There was still one final piece to deliver. The moment demanded an invitation not just to witness, but to act. Judge Thapar tried to corner her. He tried to use his stature, his authority, his polished tone as weapons, but Jasmine Crockett shut him down instantly. Not with arrogance, not with anger, but with truth delivered so clearly, so calmly, that it rippled across the nation. And now, this story doesn't just belong to the hearing room, it belongs to us, to everyone who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told to know their place, to every immigrant family that's carried dignity across oceans, to every worker, every student, every person who's ever stood up to someone in power and refused to bow. This wasn't just political theater, it was a reminder of what courage looks like in real time. A reminder that power only works if we agree to be silent. And a reminder that when we stand up for truth, even the most arrogant attempts to corner us can collapse into dust. But here's the thing, this can't just be a story we watch. It has to be a movement we build together. If you felt pride when Crockett spoke, if you felt chills when she refused to be cornered, then don't let that feeling stop here. Subscribe, share this story. Be part of the community that refuses to bow to arrogance and intimidation. Every time you amplify voices like Crockett's, you shift the balance. Every time you speak up, you make the next confrontation a little easier for someone else to win. Because dignity isn't given, it's claimed. Justice isn't handed down, it's fought for. And this fight, it belongs to all of us. So join us, stand with us, and let's keep proving, together, that truth always triumphs.